Great, thank you very much, Louise. So I've got about 20 minutes, and I've got about 4 things that I would like to do. I'd like to just, first of all, set a bit of context about the industry. We've got a mixed audience here, some from business, some from infrastructure, some from the BRCs themselves. So I apologize when I touch on an area that you're very familiar with, but hopefully some of it won't be so familiar. 4 things. First of all, to give you a sense of setting the industry in context. Second, to give you a sense of the scale of the industry that is coming this way. Third, talk a little bit about the Catapult and what it has done, and then what we see as the future going forwards, and hopefully leave you with a sense of how we can help you, because that's what we're set up to do. I'll start with the context, and I'm using an example from the States for 2 reasons. One is because Emily Whitehead, who's the little girl in the picture, has made it very clear that she wants us to talk about her story. But the second thing is that it's a sort of a talisman for the Catapult, because at the time that Emily was in this condition, we were just setting up. And she failed 2 lines of treatment, and the clinicians approached her parents and said, you need to prepare for the fact that we have no other treatment options left. And then the opportunity came up for her to go into clinical trial. She went into a clinical trial for a CAR T. She became incredibly sick and went into intensive care. And one of the important points about this, and particularly in the context of what we're talking about here, is that if she hadn't been in an institution that was as well set up and as well resourced as our BRCs, it happened to be in the States, but the analogy is there, she would not have survived. There were a number of events that took place during that treatment where expert clinicians, in the right circumstances, with the right resources around them, and in that case, with the right drugs happening to be in the pharmacy, were able to make on-the-spot decisions based upon the information they had and change the course of that little girl's life, but also to change the course of the industry, because actually if it had gone wrong, then maybe the CAR T industry wouldn't be thriving in the way that it is doing today. And this is Emily, just actually a year ago. She's coming up, hopefully, for 6 years cancer-free. And I think it's just a beautiful story. So how big could this be? Well, the first thing to say is you often get that the industry is often compared to the monoclonal industry, which one could think of as being sort of much less heterogeneous than the regenerative medicine industry. There are many, many different things going on at the same time. We talk about gene therapy, but within gene therapy, you've got in vivo gene modification, ex vivo gene modification. You've got cell therapy, which has a variety of different streams to it. So there's all sorts of activity going on at the same time at the moment. Some of it's much further ahead. Some of it's yet to come. If you look at that in the context of the monoclonal industry, so this curve represents the growth profile of the monoclonals industry over the last 30 years. It's an enormous industry. And if what we're talking about now follows the same path, and it's perfectly possible it could follow a greater and more rapid path, then there's a lot to come. Because really, when you look at it, if you look at predictions, for 2025, we'll be about there on the curve, which kind of puts us about there on the curve right now. That's a hell of a lot of growth. That's a hell of a lot of activity to come. Now, is there evidence for that? Well, I'm not going to go through these one by one, but this is a list of therapeutics that are coming through with clinical trial data, and the clinical trial data is very impressive. I'll come back to Emily in a second. And it's expected there'll be about 40 approvals coming through over the next few years. This is just one slide, actually. These are the clinical trials that are going on at the moment, and it keeps going on. This is an enormous amount of growth. Now, to put that in the context of the UK, there are about 800 and odd companies worldwide involved in cell and gene therapies. Over a quarter of them are in Europe. And then if you look down at the UK, you see that about a quarter of that activity, far bigger than anywhere else, is within the UK. So it's already here. We already are a leading sector. Now let's drill down a bit further. You start to see the dominance of the Southeast in that. There's also a very good spread across the country. There is actually a fantastic set of skills, and Simon illustrated some of that earlier on. And if you drill down a little bit further, so we compile a database where we do it from public sources because it's actually quite difficult to extract information from very busy clinicians. And we map out where we think things are happening in the thing. And our delineation of boundaries is slightly different from yours. So the Southampton is included in this group as well. And you can see, and we map out the hotspots so we know who to talk to and who we can offer help to. And you come down to London and you start to see things get even hotter still, and UCL and King's featuring extremely prominently on there and driving a lot of what's going on within the UK. But there's other universities as well that are also extremely active. Okay, so why isn't it just plain sailing? What is it about this industry that means that you need a catapult? You know, why do you need some sort of help along the way? Well, the first thing is to think about some of the dynamics of that treatment of Emily. So that was a single therapy, a single treatment that was given to her, a single dose that's left her disease-free for hopefully 6 years so far, and the potential for a lifetime disease-free. That's a very different relationship between the therapeutic and the patient and the clinician than we're used to. And it brings a number of issues because you've got long-term outcomes from a single dose, and I might come back to that a bit later. Emily was part of a group who went into the clinical trial whose prognosis was death. And then you go from an effectiveness rate of 0 to 80 or 90% remission in some cases with some of these drugs. That drives, for those of you that remember your medical statistics, the need for very low patient numbers to achieve statistical significance. And the result of that is that you've got trials that can be done extremely quickly. Okay? That is both beneficial because it means the cost comes down. It's also a problem because it means that the data set is not as broad, it's not as representative. It also means that you've got issues coming through around obsolescence because people can bring new drugs through just as quickly. You've got issues around the manufacturing process of these. These are live drugs. They start, particularly in the case of autologous therapies, they start with patient material from that patient. You have to take it from the patient, you have to manufacture it and modify it in a very sophisticated way, and you have to get it back to that patient, being absolutely sure it gets there. That affects the cost. You've got the infrastructure of the hospitals themselves. It's different. Now, there's a lot of expertise goes into running these clinical trials, which ultimately would need to be passed out to the rest of the healthcare system in some controlled manner. And the healthcare system itself, the classic pharmaceutical companies, this is not something they're used to. It's not something they've seen before, and they're having to adjust their own models to this. But when you've got efficacy rates of 80, 90%, and you've got life-changing cures, there's enough value in there for the system. There's enough value in there for the patients that these things are actually happening. It is driving enormous amounts of change. So if I try to summarize the role of the catapult, this is as simple as I can make it. In a conventional drug development scenario, this is the thing that matters the most. When you're developing a small molecule, what matters is the clinical effect and making sure that you can demonstrate all of that. You know that actually the manufacturing cost for a small molecule is somewhere around £2,000 a ton, okay? You don't have to worry about it. You know that if you can show a clinical effect and you have a reasonably decent cost of goods, that you'll be able to achieve a price that makes it viable, providing that the clinical effect is good enough. It's not the case in our industry at the moment because actually this cost is extremely high. It's very unsophisticated at the moment. There's a hell of a long way to go in developing new processes. And because of things like I described before, single dose and a lifetime of effect, we've got all sorts of economic effects, budgetary effects going on that change the dynamics of the industry and make it actually quite difficult to adopt. Our role is to try and address these things primarily while helping you guys deal with these things because they have to run together. There is no point in bringing a brilliant clinical product to the hospitals unless it is supported by the ability for somebody to pay for it and for it to be manufactured cost effectively. So looking at the catapult itself in terms of what are we, how do we do that? It's a big investment by government. Our mandate, we're driven primarily, well, at the moment by a grant, but we get quite a significant amount of income from companies who come to us and say, look, you've assembled together 160 and it seemed to be 200 experts obsessed with cell and gene therapy who are looking at every single aspect of it. Can we tap into that? And we say yes, because that's part of our role. We have a development facility based in Guy's. It's a floor that I think it used to belong to King's. And we've developed a manufacturing development facility up near Stevenage. I have to emphasize that we're not a manufacturer ourselves. The purpose of the facility in Stevenage is to create an environment in which companies can develop those manufacturing processes that I referred to earlier on, so they can operate at scale with product that is suitable to go into patients, in order to develop their systems, so that when we get to the next generation of scale for this industry, that we're able to handle it. This is really just to illustrate the relationship between what we do and the clinical research side of things. If you are making decisions about manufacturing, which many companies are right now, and I travel quite a lot for the business, and people are really grappling with the manufacturing question because it affects the business model of the companies. There are an enormous amount of things going on that are all changing at the moment. You know? There's lots of indications coming through. Manufacturing processes are changing very rapidly. The cost of those processes is coming down. Now, the product life cycles is shortening because people are actually planning for obsolescence. They're actually saying, you know what? My drug will be replaced in 5 years' time by somebody. I better replace it myself. That affects the whole manufacturing dynamic. I could go on and on. The point being, there's a lot there that needs to work in tandem, at the same time as the development of the clinical product. It's just a quick shot of our manufacturing facility. It gives you a sense of the scale of it, but also the commitment of the government towards putting this infrastructure in place. There are currently 6 clean room suites. There's a second floor that has just been funded by government. So there'll be 12 large manufacturing spaces, roughly the size of a tennis court, okay, which is much bigger than each one the size of a tennis court. And it's already starting to generate an effect. Jim is here and be on the panel later on from Autolus. These are the companies that have committed to come into the space. Some of these companies had manufacturing actually abroad and are relocating it to the UK. Others may have made decisions to stay in the UK as a result of the presence of this facility and start to develop the infrastructure so that this is obviously in the southeast, it's here in Stevenage, it means that you've got this growing cluster, this critical mass that will continue to attract in activity from all over the world. And we continuously get approached by companies who are basically now saying, okay, so we've built our activity, we've built our presence, we've got traction in the US, and now what we want to do is think about where we put down our European footprint. How do we, that's happened 3 times yesterday in Amsterdam. Companies come along saying, we want to think about how we set up our clinical trials in the UK now. Not in Europe, in the UK now. Because they're seeing the UK, and particularly the Southeast, as the cluster for Europe. A little bit about our activities, and our activities roughly move, whilst we're highly interactive and we work together and we adapt to whatever the collaborator needs, they basically divide into 3 main groups, represented in that diagram earlier on. We've got a big activity around design and healthcare economics, and right at the beginning, understanding where you're going with the product. Because there's a trail of companies over the last 20 years in this space who have invested, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars in building infrastructure around a product that wasn't actually properly thought through in the first place. And I can't emphasize enough from my perspective that the early decisions you make about how you design your product, you make those decisions when you start to design your clinical trial, because the product that you take into clinical trial is the one that you will follow through with. You can make adjustments, and we've shown that. But it's really important to have that interaction at the beginning to make sure that you set yourself on a course for commercialization, because we want these products to go to patients. And unless there is a company behind them, they will not be carried beyond your own neighborhood. It's the companies that will take them across the world to treat patients all over the world. I'm just emphasizing some of the things I talked about before. Curative treatments are brilliant things, but they create headaches for the system to deal with. Who pays? I mean, one of the classic ones, I think, is, some of these therapeutics have a $500,000, $1 million price tag on them, partly representing the fact that it's a one-off dose, and that's a lot less than multiple doses of some other drugs. But actually, from a healthcare payer point of view, that's a nightmare. Not only does it blow the budget, but then there's the whole risk thing. What happens when the patient gets run over when they walk out the door and you've just paid $1 million for it? Somebody has to think through those problems, and that's part of our role at the Catapult to deal with that. The second stream of what we do is looking at taking the early stage and brilliant processes that we see that are developed in the academic environment and preparing them, and in some cases taking them through that process for scale and safety and mass production. We're thinking of a world where we're moving from 20 patients in a clinical trial to 4,000 doses a day or a week. It's a completely different dynamic. And we look at all aspects of that, right down to the individual process itself, to the whole systems around it. And the manufacturing center that we have allows us to do that because we can bring together companies and look at the logistical systems, et cetera, et cetera. This is an illustration for the non-clinicians, basically. I'm sure the clinicians have seen this all before. This is an example of a CAR T, a TCR, in fact. Sorry, Emma. And it's the modified cells, it's on a loop, attacking the cancer cells, migrating to it, attacking the cancer cells, and leaving dead cells. It's a brilliant illustration of the power of the therapeutic. And obviously, if that was happening in a patient, then they'd have a bit of a problem if it was happening all that quickly. But the exciting bit of it from the techie end, if you like, the catapult end of this, is actually that's taking place on an impedance plate with an electrical signal running through it. And as the cells are destroyed, the signal changes, allowing to create a digital signal of the potency of the therapeutic, which allows you to start to open up all kinds of manufacturing and mass production type techniques. And the third stream of what we do is helping with the development of the clinical process. And actually, we work with Emma Morris, which is the one that's referred to at the bottom, on trying to provide some assistance and infrastructure around some of the clinical trial that she's doing and some of the great work that she is doing. I'll touch briefly. I wasn't sure whether I was going to mention the ATTCs, but Simon mentioned them earlier on. So I will take the risk. The ATTCs, for those that are not familiar with them, Advanced Therapy Treatment Centres, are an initiative set up by Innovate UK to create a number of centres where there is learning, where the learning is concentrated around the development of this industry. And it's not just about the actual centres themselves, and Simon mentioned them earlier on, named them earlier on. It's also about the connection of those centres to the infrastructure of the industry. So the connection to the manufacturing centre, the connection to the data collection, the logistics and everything like that, and learning how the manufacturing centre works. And the intention is that those lessons are then rolled out in a controlled manner to enable the development of the industry. There isn't I'll bite that bullet on it. There isn't a London-based hospital in that network at the moment. It is firmly our intention in our coordinating role to make sure that there are, and there are discussions ongoing about that at the moment, because we think it's extremely important that there are as many of the London hospitals in there as we can possibly, or London groups in there as we can possibly get. I will jump on from that. Right, just a little bit about blowing our trumpet about what we've done over the last few years. I'll rattle through this. I've talked about what we set up. It was nothing. When Emily treatment was failing, there was nothing in terms of the Catapult. Since that time, we've engaged with about 28 research groups and 54 different company projects. It may be the same research groups. And that's resulted in a whole range of different technologies coming out and being used by the industry. 8 new spin-out companies have come out of our activity over that period of time. About 500 million has been invested in the companies that we've worked with directly, some of which they attribute very clearly to our role. Important for us in our economic mandate is that 11 companies that we've been talking with have made decisions to invest in the UK as a result of our activity. And 7 companies have decided to either keep or bring their manufacturing activity in the UK. That manufacturing activity is critical to the growth of this industry. That's what brings the research and development alongside it, which brings the need for the clinical trials. But it also is what creates the high-value jobs. The industry's grown like crazy. When we started up, I could say that I knew the CEOs of all of the cell therapy companies in the UK by name, by first name, because there were 6 of them. I don't now, because there are about 60 companies actually. These numbers are slightly out of date. We've seen about the clinical trial growth. That's been enormous. And the manufacturing space, both in terms of the amount of it and the utilization, has been going through the roof over that period of time. The 1,500 jobs is a massive underestimate in terms of the growth that's come through. We're about to do our biannual survey and find out what that is. And the industry's had about £1.5 billion worth of investment. So, and we've had a role in all of that. We're not claiming we've claimed it, we've caused it, but we've assisted it. Just looking forwards a bit about how we can be involved going forwards in the future. We went out and we've talked to the industry, we've talked to as many people as we can, and said, what are the problems that you're going to face going forwards? What are the things that you would like us to do to make the growth of the industry easier and more rapid? And these are the things that came out. Clinical adoption is still a big issue. People, how are these things going to be used effectively in the hospital environment, in the healthcare environment? How are the people going to get it paid for them? People still worry about the regulatory side of things. I actually think we've got a fantastic regulator here who's incredibly helpful. And we've spent a lot of time working with companies going, it's not the regulator that's causing the problems here. It's the understanding and the interpretation of the way things happen. And once you get a dialogue going, things change. Viral vector supply, short-term, big issue, which many people are working on. The whole supply chain, manufacturing, cost of goods we've talked about already. And then the last one on that list is, the growth that we're seeing here is going to result in a massive shortage of skills. There's just not going to be enough people around to feed the growth of the industry. And I know some people in this room are already feeling that. So a slightly complicated slide, but I just wanted to point to these things here. That's what we've been doing over the last 5 years. Over the next 5 years, these are our main themes. Commercialization of research. A large part of what we've been doing today, working with the universities to help in the commercialization of research. Trying to deal immediately with the viral vector issue, and then looking at all of the fantastic new gene modification technologies that are coming through and seeing how we can play our role in assisting those. Manufacturing technologies, manufacturing and cost of goods relation, the manufacturing center itself and the supply chain around it. Working with the UK government, in particular, NHS England, to bring about adoption in a way that is controlled and understood, that allows companies to build up that knowledge and a price that they can then use to export out to the rest of the world. And unfortunately, we also have to deal with our little bit of the Brexit experience, because there's going to be some regulatory change, and we're going to do our bit to make that as smooth as we possibly can, although we make no claims of control over that process. What we hope will come out of that is this world-leading research ecosystem will continue, because it already exists, and that's what we've been talking about today. The UK will become the centre for manufacturing in Europe, and I think that's already happening. People are seeing that. Now they have to ask themselves why they wouldn't come to the UK to do their cell and gene therapy manufacturing. That the products actually get to the patients. And then there's an economic spin out that the products actually start to move abroad. One last note, just a simple, straightforward point about how we can work with researchers. One of the points I made very early on was that some of the things that affect adoption are decisions made very, very early in the process. So we would like to be able to have a light touch involvement with people as early as possible in their thoughts about the research that they're doing and how they're developing it, so that we can help you think through some of the issues that you probably wouldn't see normally in the clinical development pathway, so that actually the progress, the ability to raise further funding, whether it's grant funding or investment funding, is much, much easier because the design is there from the start. And then in the later stage, we'd like to get involved with some groups more intensively on bringing our resources into the development. We're not going to develop the whole industry. What we're trying to find is exemplars that we can move forwards with that show everybody else that the pathway is navigable. And the last word I will give to Emily, which is collaboration. Everything that we're doing, we need to work together, we need to work with you, we need to work with the industry, and I look forward to many, many years of great growth. Thank you very much.